Introducing me. So, picked up the paper the other day. No, that's not true. I went online and looked at the newspaper the other day, and one of the headline articles in the Business Herald was of a visiting professor from UCLA, Professor Sebastian Edwards. He said of New Zealand after visiting here and looking around and talking to people, New Zealand resembles a neurotic Woody Allen character whose depression and complaints are unjustified. The population is convinced that the future looks bleak. So I think that's a fitting way to start and to contrast what Idealog is doing for us. I grew up really reading Business 2.0 as the magazine of the time and took a lot of inspiration from that magazine, continue to read a lot of business these days as well. And I think when I think about Idealog, I really think about the people who are 17 through 25, who are taking inspiration from that magazine and will go and start a business as a result of the stories that are being told. So we'll start off with a hand for Idealog, and congratulations on the relaunch. I'm a bit sick of this negativity in New Zealand, actually, to be honest. I get invited about twice a week to go and talk to a Why New Zealand is Fucked conference. And I don't know why we keep having them. Has anything ever come out of any of these conferences? I haven't gone to very many, but they seem very negative. So what I want to talk about today is just 3 examples of why things are not so grim. Talk about 3 businesses. I'm going to talk about the first one very quickly because it's not my business. Neither are the other 2 particularly, but so let's talk about Xero. So Xero raised $50 million off an idea. On the New Zealand stock market, they raised 2/3 of that, and subsequently have raised in private placements through very high net worth Australian, the founder of MYOB, the biggest competitor to Xero in Australia, has invested after being kicked out by a private equity firm in Australia. We've got Peter Thiel, one of the founders of PayPal, invested, achieved 36,000 customers, first 3 years, 110 staff based in Wellington. Revenue's gone 1 million, 3 million, 9 million. These are very, very similar numbers to what TradeMe was doing in the early days. We had, I think the 3 years before we sold to Fairfax, we were 4, 9, 15, 25 in terms of our revenues. And then we sold it, and then it went 45, and it's now at about 100 and something million of earnings per year. $200 million market cap. So out of nothing, we've created a potential for $1 billion business. Let's talk about Pacific Fibre. That's number 2. Pacific Fibre, I think, is a really important piece of infrastructure for us, and we've decided to do this because no one else was. Didn't particularly want to get into infrastructure. It's sort of a little bit different to where I come from. The goals that we had were twofold. One is sick of data caps. Data caps are basically a manifestation of the high price of international bandwidth. So the way that ISPs manage their high cost of international bandwidth is they impose data caps on you, and it goes slow in rush hour, sort of between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. at night. The internet's a bit slow. That's largely due to the international connectivity. And the second objective with it was to make the ultra-fast broadband project work. That project, in our view, does not work without fixing the international connectivity. So if we look at New Zealand now, we've got a single provider of international connectivity, the Southern Cross Cable. Now, there's one point that people are continually failing to get, so I'm going to try and say it in a way where it sticks. We have a single provider of international bandwidth. It is not a technology problem, it is a market problem. We have a single provider, they therefore set the price with which we connect to the world. That is the problem. The problem is not one of, do we have enough capacity on Southern Cross? Do we have enough, is that technology good enough? Is that cable resilient enough? Those are not the questions. The question is, do we think that it's going to be better for consumers and the people who serve the consumers that buy the bandwidth on these cables to have more than one provider? These cables go on for a long time, so there's a very, very good chance if we weren't doing this that my daughter will get to my age and we'll still have one provider of international connectivity. There are cables coming out of Australia. There's no reason why cables need to hit New Zealand on the way past. We're not that big. The price of international data in New Zealand is sort of illustrated by this kind of broad number. So if you were to buy, say, a 10 gigabit wavelength standard sort of unit in New Zealand, that costs about $15–16 million. In Japan, to connect to the US, or in Europe to connect to the US, it's closer to $400,000. The biggest costs inside ISPs is customer support and international bandwidth. So if an ISP is going to be profitable, they need to they need to basically give you as poor customer support as possible, as few customer service representatives as possible, or they need to buy as little international bandwidth as possible. It's basically the two levers. 80% of our content's consumed overseas, so we're all on Facebook and YouTube. And I was in my lounge in my office the other day and got some board papers coming through, and I threw it onto Dropbox, walked through to my lounge, opened up my iPad, turned it on, flipped my iPad on and read the document. That document, in the meantime, I had pushed to the US, to Dropbox, and then walked to my lounge and pulled it back from the US. All of the stuff we're doing is in the US. We know that the broadband subscriber numbers are going up. What really surprised me was that there's been an inflection point in the amount of usage that people are in the growth of usage of data. This is largely driven by video. So it's driven by peer-to-peer video with Skype, and it's driven by us watching YouTube and so forth. Now, if you go onto Skype and you decide that you want to increase your bandwidth or your video resolution, you can kind of eat all the bandwidth that you want. So you have these 55-inch TVs now that come out and sit on the wall and have Skype cameras built in, full HD, and they run at whatever resolution they can get in the bandwidth. So we can eat this stuff up. The NBN and the UFB, the NBN is the Australian version, the National Broadband Network, I think, and the Ultra-Fast Broadband Initiative in New Zealand. These things are happening. They've done the contracts now, so Telstra and Optus were awarded billions of contracts in Australia last week. We've awarded contracts in New Zealand, to Telecom most notably. These things are happening. So this part of the world is going to have fibre to the premise. The problem we have is that it's really only fibre to the border of the country. Unless we solve this issue of international bandwidth, we will still have a toll gate effectively with a single toll provider. And these companies, these cable companies, are very international in nature and very difficult to regulate. They are, if you said to Southern Cross, could you need to drop your prices, they just won't sell here. They'll just sell in Australia because that's their market. One of the things we learned at TradeMe was that we invested an awful amount of time in making things faster, easier to use and faster. That was all we tried to do really, and then we added the odd feature. And as long as usability is the biggest issue with keeping people on websites, and speed is the biggest driver of usability. So if you can improve your peering points, if you can improve your load times and browsers and so forth, then people stay online longer. And so I guess the parallel with with generalized broadband use is that if it's fast, you use it. If it's not fast, you don't use it. And so there's actually a supply issue. It's not demand driven, it's supply driven. And so in countries where they have very high connectivity rates, they simply use it differently and do different things with it. So some of the drivers, obviously music was the NBN and the UFB. Just going back a step, the parallel of the iPod unleashing digital music. So we had digital music for a long time, people were still buying CDs, and then it got easy enough for the generalised population to be able to do that. It was easy enough for my mum to have an iPod and my mum to be able to buy songs on iTunes and so forth, and so she does. Interestingly, New Zealand has the highest rate of video piracy in the world. And the reason for that is because you can't buy video here. So you can't buy it online, you just go get it anyway. So, these things are going to come, these services, because they need to actually monetize those revenues. YouTube is a big driver, Facebook's a big driver, new devices are a big driver, iPads. In my lounge, I've got an Xbox and a PlayStation and a Wii and a Sky Decoder. All those things are internet connected. They can all pull services off the internet. I've got Netflix sitting on these devices. So we have these digital media services. Netflix has got 25 million people signed up to their video on demand service. So that means you go, sit down in front of your TV, pick up a remote control, navigate to any movie that's ever been made, watch the movie, video on demand. It's $8 a month. So, and all this stuff is hosted in the US. So those services, those consumer services will be here if the bandwidth is cheap enough. And all of these guys build these services now with absolutely no consideration of our data caps. They just assume you don't have them because other places don't have them. Or they're so high that they're not material. So the latest MacBook, or the latest operating system for the Mac, Lion OS I think it's called, is 4.5 gigabytes. It's only available on download. They're not going to send disks out. So you've got, my computer doesn't even have a CD drive in it, DVD drive in it. So, it's all moving to the cloud. All the products that we buy, all the stuff that we consume is moving that direction. We're basically on the bus, we're not on the bus.